those days, most of the people in the Grateful Dead would get in their room and usually you've brought something to get high on, or were meeting people who would come. If they were in New York, people would come immediately. You arrived in town and bring you something to get high on. But the drummers were, they loved to go out, Billy or Mickey, together or separately. They would go out and then it would be a matter of, well, where are the drummers gone? And I always knew that they'd probably gone to the nearest drum store. So I used to ask down at the, to find somebody, first thing is you go down to the front desk, and you ask the guy on the door, did you see one of my people come out of here? Or what do he look like? Well, he, described it. Oh yeah, he went that way. He didn't tell you where he was going. No, he didn't tell me. I said, are there any drum stores down there? Oh yeah, well if you go down to 42nd and whatever, So okay, and if you wanted to get them back, you had to go there and get them. I mean, nowadays, you're the drummer, I'm the tour manager. Hey Courtney, remember we've got to leave the hotel, the cars are leaving at 3 o'clock. Okay, click. In those days, slightly different.
Yeah, it's a very different world.
But, I mean, a lot of people talk about the 60s, with kind of rampant nostalgia. I don't kind of feel like that myself, personally. I mean, I don't think that things are any better or worse today than they were then. And I could, people come up to me and they say, oh, you were so lucky, you had such a great life, man. You lived in the 60s. Oh, I wish I'd lived in the 60s, but, I wasn't old enough, I missed it. And I said, you know what my mother used to tell me? No, they look at me like, what? And I said, my mother used to say, oh, how much she wished she'd been in Berlin in the 20s, and how wonderful Berlin must have been in the 1920s,
the Roaring 20s.
The Roaring 20s, and to be in Berlin. Okay, well, her generation missed some stuff too. Every generation seems to think that there was a golden era, that preceded them, that they've just missed because mummy and daddy, bonked 10 years too late, kind of thing. When's do you have a kind of golden era,
or
does it all kind of melt into one?
Truly, the late 60s through the mid 70s was the golden era. It was the golden era of rock and roll, as far as I'm concerned. There was most creativity going on in the late 60s into the early 70s with music. That's still the music I like the best, and it's not just because of the nostalgia part of it was there was wonderful music. Of course, Crosby, Stills and Nash had a sound that was second to none when they came out. It was their harmonies and their beautiful soaring songs of inspiration and love and harmony. That was really sensational music. We'd never heard anything like it.
Because the old cynics from the Rolling Stones and stuff, they looked at all that.
They looked a bit.
It looked a little. It was irredeemably twee.
It was very twee.
Woodland and fey.
Well, it was the difference between the Beatles and the Stones.
Indeed.
The Beatles. I mean, the Stones.
Were you a
fans,
Beatles man or a Stones man? Tell the truth.
I honestly liked the Beatles. I had heard a lot of the Beatles before I ever heard the Stones.
Right.
And now I like them both. My brother became a hardcore Stones fan, so of course I had to, stand in opposition. But I liked them both. Right. They were both fantastic. For nitty-gritty rock and roll, I liked the Stones. I loved the harmonies of the Beatles.
See, people used to ask me that,
yeah.
Were you a Stones or a Beatles fan? And I used to go, the Beatles. Your mum liked the Beatles. You know what I mean? The Beatles were actually the first long-haired rock and roll band. And I asked my mum one time, well, why do you like them? I said, they've got long hair. You always give me a hard time about long hair. And my mum said, oh yeah, but their hair's clean. What can you do? I can never win with my mother,
Right.
I got the job with the Rolling Stones, which for me, I was what? Let me think exactly. I was 26 years old. I was at the peak of my kind of professionalism, or whatever you call it, you know what I mean? I was ruling the world here. I got a job as the tour manager for the Rolling Stones, and I'd just done that show in Hyde Park with 150,000 people at it, right? No, what more? 300,000 people at it, actually. And everything was cool, no one was arrested, no one got sick.
Right, now that was the show you put on.
Yeah, I put that show on for the Stones.
Right.
And I'd gone to see my mother a couple of days later, went down in a limousine, and it was the typical English thing, everyone peeping from behind their lace curtains, going, oh look, there's a limousine outside Dora's house, I wonder, oh that's her son. Well, he's one of those dirty rock and rollers, you know, and all that. And my mother, I said to her, oh yeah, we just did this show in 300,000 people were at it, Mum, in Hyde Park. My mother said, well, there was 500,000 people at the Chartist demonstration in Hyde Park. Okay, well, I said, and no one got arrested. She said, well, of course not. People aren't supposed to get arrested. They're supposed to know how to behave themselves. Okay. I said, well, all right, don't worry about it. I said, I've got a job with the Rolling Stones, and you know what? They've given me a credit card. My mother looks at me, she says, a credit card? What's a credit card? So I explained what a credit card was. She said, oh, no. She said, no. Shouldn't have that. No, that's shocking. You know, spending money that you don't have, that's ridiculous, you know. So I said, okay, well, all right. I said, well, you know, yeah, they've offered me the job as tour manager, you know, it's like, you know, one of the best bands in the world. This is a huge thing. She looks at me, and with only an English woman can say it, with a withering tone, she says, yes, but it's not a proper job, is it?
Well, she was right
She
there.
was damn right there. But, you know, I didn't speak to my mother for several years after that.
Aww.
We decided to go our separate ways. We reconciled in the end, but
That's good.
the Rolling Stones were never, if you like, mother material, you know.
Hardly,
Because,
not hardly.
you know, can you see your mother, baby, standing in the shadows? The Stones knew about mums, you know what I mean? They were pretty hardcore when it came to motherhood. And of course, you know, they had their reputation, didn't they? Whereas the Beatles, who were just as naughty, I'm sure, in fact, I know they were, the Beatles managed to avoid that kind of negative stuff.
Well, they had a lot cleaner image.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the, I guess, you know, the Stones being the more hardcore rockers that they are, compared to the Beatles, it would be like mods and rockers, which are the big movements in England in those 60s.
Yeah.
I used to run with the rockers. I was actually on Brighton Beach one time with a mob of bikers and their girlfriends. You know, they were all wheeling chains and stuff, and I was just much younger, but I was in a class with older boys. I was in a class with boys 3-4 years older than me. Just because they kept putting me up in classes for, you know, academia content, I guess. But anyway, so I was standing in what would be my brother's group, which would be the Rockers, because he favoured the Stones, and he was riding, you know, with the Scooter Boys, the Mods, which would be more like the Beatles side. So we were in juxtaposition again. But of course, that's all kids stuff in retrospect, even though, you know, nobody.
Well, the English are very tribal, aren't they, you know?
So it would appear.
Yeah,
Yes,
sure,
I mean, they're
man.
certainly an insular, savage bunch of people when it comes to fighting.
They managed to, you know, they managed to conquer 2/3 of the world, bless them, but that they didn't conquer New Zealand. No, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, those years, I was going to ask you a question actually, because I know that you hung out with Crosby and Crosby, Stills and Nash and those guys for a long time. What, you know, I never saw Crosby and Crosby, Stills and Nash that I remember ever kind of adopt the tie-dye thing.
No.
Whereas the Grateful Dead, it almost was exclusively the Grateful Dead that kind of adopted
It
tie-dye, wasn't it?
Well,
I'm trying to think of other bands that employed it, and I can't really remember.
well, John Sebastian was
John
a performer,
Sebastian.
and he did his
Yeah.
own tie-dye work,
Mhm.
and he has still to this day has some notoriety in the relative to the tie-dye world. I don't know how good his tie-dyes was. I can't really remember
Right.
how good they were. But I know
The
that-
Loving Spoonful, John Sebastian.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there's a retro show coming up in at the De Young Museum in San Francisco in the Golden Gate Park. It's for the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love,
Sure.
which is coming up next year, of course, and which is, you know, that's in retrospect of 1967, and I guess that's Sebastian's era. He has a part of that show, and actually my oldest mandala will be there at that show.
Cool.
It's called it's a soft faded. Of course, it's called Stellar Blue.
Right.
But it was at a number of the venues that the band played at, or Garcia's band played at, and it hung here or there at Mickey's Farm for parties. It's been all over, and it's pretty tattered and faded, but it's that old blue is really still a beauty.
It's hung in there.
It's got a faded glory about it. So Janis Joplin was into the tie-dyes.
Sure, Janis was, yeah.
Of course, Jimi Hendrix had he'd have a tie-dye bandana. You know, he had these little flashes of colour about him in those years.
Nobody really, though, took on tie-dye like the Grateful Dead did they? Really, if you
no,
think about it.
Prior to my advent on the scene, Phil Lesh's girlfriend at the time, Rosie McGee, she was doing some...
She was called Florence.
She was called Florence, yes.
Bless her, she was a beautiful girl.
Beautiful girl. She was the one that would dance on stage in all her naked glory, and did a damn good job of it too. But she was producing modest tie-dyes that actually lasted down through the ages. Mostly people had worked with Rip Dye or so. I think she was definitely a lot further along than that. And even though her dyes were more of a classic form, they seemed to last through the ages. And some of the equipment, well, Phil's particularly, his monitors and small amplifiers, had her work on. And even in the days when I had the full stage set of my work, there would always be one or two little pieces of Rosie's up there, Florence. So I wasn't the first whose work they showed in the tie-dye realm. I know Phil loved the tie-dyes.
Yeah.
Garcia liked the colours. He really liked my tie-dyes. He loved the images. He used to look in and just play, and it was quite touching. He'd just really take off, especially in those early days when they were new and fresh. Where he didn't really care about tie-dyes that much, but he was always very supportive, of course. And it went very well with the scene, the music. Of course, when the whole stage array came out with tie-dyes, the fans took it to themselves as part of the Grateful Dead, and it became synonymous with the music. And of course that's proliferated it through millions of people into the whole world.
Absolutely.
And so it's not lost, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I see a kind of progression from art in the sense of painting, and the kind of Dali stuff that was done in between the war years, and the surrealist stuff that was done, all of which kind of sought to address altered states of consciousness using paint, and that the tie-dye, in fact, in effect, became, for me at least, and I think for millions of other people really, became the art of our sense of altered consciousness. And it answered a visual need that wasn't being met anywhere else really. Because by the time the Grateful Dead started to become really popular in the early 70s, there was a lot of people out there who knew about the Grateful Dead, loved the Grateful Dead, all of whom, I mean, let's not beat about the bush here, all of whom had substantial psychedelic experiences. So they knew that the inner vision, if you like, was complex, multicoloured, eternal, of great depth and breadth, and that the only place really that was being answered really, it was in tie-dyes. And having said that, I immediately started to think about Jackson Pollock and his work, and the complexity and depth in that, So perhaps it's all of this is part and parcel of a piece where the music and the art and the spirituality and the consciousness all kind of move together on a broad front.
Well, there's a gestalt involved.
Yeah.
Pierre, with most ideas, movements, turns of consciousness. I think it's experienced all over the planet in various interpretations by many people. It seems to be intelligence coming through the universe when its time arrives.
Isn't it interesting
like
though? You know, absolutely. I mean, but it's very interesting. I mean, I know the Rolling Stones, for example, personally. I know that they took plenty of acid, but then they came up with, you know, that bizarre record. Their kind of acid-influenced record, if you like to call it that. The
Satanic Majesty's
Satanic Majesty's Request was dreadful. Their least successful creative response, in effect, was to psychedelics. They didn't do too well on it, did they?
They didn't really take off from that. Although their music was certainly, well, it would be enhanced by the taking of psychedelics.
I must admit, I never found the Rolling Stones music that amenable to the psychedelic experience. I mean, I've listened to the Rolling Stones on LSD, and I found it all rather grim and kind of totalitarian.
It was a bit dark.
Yeah, and dark for my taste, you know.
Compared to the Grateful Dead free-form.
Or Crosby, Stills and Nash and the lighter.
That was light and beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I need light and beauty in my life, you know.
We all aspire to light and beauty. Well, not all of us, but you would think that people would want to. But certainly those early times, mostly everybody's aspiring to a freedom and a more in-depth sharing with universal consciousness, brotherhood, sisterhood, and just being one in our great cosmos. There was that feeling, even if people didn't really have a way to interpret it. Exactly, there were a lot of the arts were moving that way.
I could see Mick, if Mick could listen to this conversation right now, Mick and Keith would be chuckling merrily in the background going, what a load of rubbish, man. You know, there is a certain, of course, and I mean, that's where their contribution, if you like, to music and the form generally, it's not just that it's the dark side, it's also that it's the cynical side, it's the nasty side, it's the side that if you're foolish enough to allow yourself to get tied up in bed, who knows what might happen to you side. It's not particularly light and...
well, it's openly rebellious.
Yeah, you know, and I think on that level, it served a very important role. What's interesting to me as well, you know, is that neither the Grateful Dead nor the Rolling Stones ever came up with songs that really, if you like, fueled any kind of revolutionary kind of headspace in their audiences. I mean, they didn't, you know, they didn't sing like, for example, Country Joe and the Fish, let's say, you know, Fixing to Die Rag at the height of the Vietnam War, Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind for All That We Might, or Your Masters of War. The Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead, I think, were similar in this respect, that neither one of them really was a kind of politically revolutionary kind of band on
they
any
didn't
level.
make political statements. Their music wasn't about that at all.
It was about an inner revolution, perhaps, with the Grateful Dead, but I don't think it was about that with the Rolling Stones. I don't think the Rolling Stones ever subscribed to that kind of view of the world. The Rolling Stones always, you know, I've always had this idea with the Rolling Stones that they just wish that they'd been born black in Chicago. You know, and they weren't, but they did their best to come across like they were, and bless them, they were wonderful.
Well, certainly they were safe to